will you stand as I read from God's Word? It's a lengthy passage nonetheless. We must read this together. Follow along as I read. In Luke 13, I'll begin with verse 22. And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. Then one said to him, Lord, are there few who are saved? And he said to them, strive to enter through the narrow gate. For many, I say to you, will seek to enter and will not be able. When once the master of the house has risen up and shut the door, you will begin to stand outside and knock at the door, saying, Lord, Lord, open for us. And he will answer and say to you, I do not know you, where you are from. Then you will begin to say, we ate and drank in your presence, and you taught in our streets. But he will say, I tell you, I do not know you, where you are from. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and yourselves thrust out. They will come from the east and the west and the north and the south and sit down in the kingdom of God. And indeed, there are last who will be first, and there are first who will be last. And on that very day, some Pharisees came, saying to him, get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you. And he said to them, go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. And then these words, listen carefully. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, and assuredly I say to you, you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for this passage. And there is much more to be said today, also from Luke chapter 9. Father, as I share with this your flock about the cost of discipleship and the price of discipleship, let us not be afraid, because you paid it all through your Son, Jesus Christ. Help us to be disciples that we should be. As we face the challenges around us, let us focus heavenward, even today, in these few moments, as we explore your word together. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. So, for the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at Luke's account as Jesus Christ is proceeding with his way to Jerusalem. Now, you have it before you, Luke chapter 13. Go back, if you would, just briefly to Luke chapter 9. First of all, in Luke chapter 9, and I'm going to read the entire passage. Some of this is familiar to you. But in Luke chapter 9, I want to talk about, first of all, the cost of discipleship. The cost of discipleship. And we're going to look at this, that Jesus Christ, in verse 51, his face is set to go to Jerusalem. You see it also in verse 53. He steadfastly set his face to Jerusalem, which means simply this. He has a plan and a purpose, and that's to get from this point to that point. This point is comfortable, that point is death. But I've got to go. The days were approaching, the Bible tells us, and he was determined and focused on going to Jerusalem. The concentration of Christ is so evident. The concentration of Christ. His focus, his face is steadfast on Jerusalem. But there's also the condemnation by the disciples. Now this is interesting. And in Luke chapter 9, verse 52, just look at this with me. He sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans. This is Luke 9, verse 52, now verse 53. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? Isn't it good to have guys like that on your team? They can take care of these people, we can knock them out. The condemnation by the disciples. This is interesting. Let me just kind of I don't want to spend a lot of time on the Samaritans and their mindset, but know this, they are half-breeds. They're not 100% Jew. They're not 100% Gentile. They're inbred. This goes back to the captivities in the Old Testament, where the Jewish people were inbred with those in Assyria and Babylon and other nations, and they came back and they weren't accepted by the pure, as it were, Jews. And so they kind of lived between Galilee and Judea, and a place called Samaria. And the Samaritans were not really impressed with all the wayfarers and travelers that came through their parts. As a matter of fact, a lot of people going to Jerusalem from the north or to Galilee from the south didn't spend a lot of time in Samaria either. But when they did, I mean, and by the way, there's that one case, right, in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, when the disciples go in to buy some food, and Jesus stays by the well, and the woman comes out, and he tells her all about her life, and then leads many in that village to a saving knowledge of him. He gives living water. But James and John didn't seem very impressed either, did they? James and John, now don't get me wrong, they had power. The Bible tells us in Mark, the Bible tells us that Christ gave the disciples power. Power to do what? Power to heal the sick, power to raise the dead, power to cast out demons. Of course, power to share the good news. But you know what Jesus Christ did not give the apostles? The power to condemn. That's what James and John were doing. They get a little arrogant, hanging out with Jesus, the most important man in the time, the one they call the Christ. And they simply wanted to rain down fire, and they knew the Old Testament, just like Elijah did, as if they've got you. Lord, we got you covered. Don't you worry about it. You know, we always pick on Peter for putting his foot in his mouth. What about this moment with James and John? They're a couple of kids, really. Probably the younger of the apostles. As a matter of fact, in Mark chapter 3, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Christ gave them the name Sons of Thunder. Rain down thunder and lightning. Bring the fire from heaven. Destroy these people. You ever thought about them to do that? Like rear the line of Chick-fil-A? From here up, just destroy them so I can get my sandwich and get out of here, right? You don't say that. But sometimes we get so angry. We want to just, Lord, if I can just take them out. And we have that mentality, but we shouldn't. The power that James and John had was not a power to condemn. And so here comes the correction by Christ. In the next few verses, he turned and rebuked them. Yes. He said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. Too many say that probably. You don't really understand what the Holy Spirit's in your life yet. And it could mean you're just being real selfish and limited. You need to stop. The Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. I'm going to make a parallel here. It's so easy to look at the antagonist and want to get away from them and push them to the side and get them out of your life. I don't think anybody here wants negative people in their life. But your job is not to push somebody away. Your push is to present the gospel and to pray for them. That's your purpose. I can't fault James and John for their passion, but Jesus corrected them in these next few verses. The disciples had limited power. Luke tells us that he called the 12 and he gave them power over demons and to cure diseases, to preach the kingdom, heal the sick. Their power was limited. It did not include judgment. It did not include condemnation, especially of a fellow man that God created. See, God is the judge of men. God is the judge of sin and righteousness, and he righteously judges. We don't do a good job of that. You see, it's the salvation of men that was important, even in Samaria. Jesus said in Luke 15, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of angels when one sinner repents. The Son of Man did not come but to seek and to save those who were lost. It's not your place, James or John, to want to bring fire down from heaven to get them out of the way and condemn them to eternal life without Jesus Christ. Your task, you have the power, the authority to share the gospel. And simply put, James and John blew it. Not to condemn men. Because the Bible tells us this, man's condemned already. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already. You know what some of the saddest words I see here in this passage is in verse 56, the last 5 words, they went to another village. I say it's sad because of this. 2 reasons, really. First of all, they had a righteous task. Christ told them, you go to a village, and you go there. Don't take anything for your journey. Don't take staff. Don't take bread. Don't take money. Don't have 2 tunics. Just go. And do that. You have a righteous task, but here's the sad part. They had a ruined testimony. Do you really think the Samaritans, if they were listening to James and John, that Jesus, we're going to bring fire on these people and destroy them? Do you think they're listening to you now? Let me ask you this question. Have you ever done that? Have you ever said something that kind of ruined your testimony? I was waiting to the store yesterday. Waiting to the store yesterday. And you know how stores are. They're so efficient. All the lanes are always open. All the cashiers are always friendly. Well, that wasn't the case across America, like yesterday. And so there's like 2 aisles, 2 lanes open, the lines are getting kind of long. And the one person in the middle had closed her light off, closed her aisle, but she was going to let me come. Sir, come over here. Well, the person in front of me, of course, I'm being the gentleman, I said, hey, why don't you go first? And she goes, and she was on her phone too, which makes it doubly weird. And she's like, I was just over there a while ago, but she was closed. I'm not going back. She can go do a shower. Didn't hurt my feelings. I checked out. I was gone. I got things to do. But the point is, that cashier, I put up a wall. And that person wouldn't go to that person's line if it was you, the last person in the store, it seems. Are we that way? We have people that we disagree with all the time. I was sharing some of this with others of you. And there was a whole group of people here Friday, some that were just not from this area, but from other areas, and I knew how they voted, and I knew their political stance because they're very vocal. So it was my job to go up there and say, hey, what do you think you're doing? My job was to, hey, it's good to see you. I've been praying for you. It's good to see you. Glad you're here. You don't want to put up those walls. You want to build those relational bridges because I'm telling you, one day they're going to have a need. Who are they going to call? My wife and I have heard this week already about how some people have seen what Christianity looks like and they want their part of it. Then there's the condition of discipleship. The condition of discipleship. You know, this is that passage in Luke chapter 9 where Jesus says, you know, in verse 57, let's pick it up there. It happened on the way that someone said, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. And he said, foxes have holes, Birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And then you have these words, and he said to another, follow me. But he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, well, let the dead bury their dead, but you go and preach the kingdom of God. Verse 61, another one also said, Lord, I will follow you, but let me first go and bid them farewell, those who are at my house. And Jesus said, no one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Can I give you really quick, these people, this someone, or these people that are talking to this another, we don't know who they are. They may be the disciples, probably people on the road as Jesus is walking. They're coming up and they're saying things like this, I'll go wherever you go, or let me follow you. But Jesus gave these lessons and these requirements for following him. And here's one of the lessons. A dwelling could be important, but it's not a priority. If you've traveled any part of the world, and maybe a third world country, and you go to their church, do you think their church has stained glass windows and electricity? I was in a church up in Ecuador. We call it the Church of the Rock because right in the middle of the church was a big rock. They couldn't move it. They just left it there. And they built around it. And they built the church only as high as they could reach. They had no ladders. Can I tell you that Ecuadorians are not 6'6"? I walked in that church, had to duck to get in the doorway and duck to worship. And this little lady, she got up and gave me a seat. I mean, she was tiny. Meaning the place that she left was tiny. But I was welcome. You know where they worshiped? Until the sun went down. They couldn't see. They couldn't see the words of the Bible. And that's when they stopped. It doesn't have to be opulent. I mean, a place is important. The house you live in is important, but it's not that important. It's not the priority. Because Christ says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but I have no place where you can call my home. Families, they matter. They're important. But not the priority. Let me preach the gospel. But the inheritance, that's important. I'm going to say goodbye to my family and everything that... No, that's not that important to you. You see, we have 3 examples, 3 excuses, 3 missed opportunities. Let me ask you this. Do you have an example of God telling you to do something? Do you have some excuses maybe you've used? Do you know how many missed opportunities you may have had? That's the cost of discipleship. What about the price of discipleship? In Luke chapter 13, turning back there to that passage. In Luke 13, discipleship is costly, but it's also priceless. Discipleship is costly, but it's also priceless. Again, Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem, like we saw in Luke 9. In verse 22 here in Luke 13, he's headed to Jerusalem. He's on a journey. And as he goes, in verse 23, there's a person's question. And it's, to me, an odd question. But the question is this: Lord, are there few who are saved? Again, we don't know who this person is, this someone. We don't know who he is. He could be a disciple. He could be one of the villagers. This one, this singular individual, asks, and Christ responds not just to that one, but to them. And crowds were always with Christ. Crowds that were believers and crowds that were adversaries. Even in Luke 13, verse 17, and when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. I mean, he had the good and the bad that followed him. He had those that were trying to trip him up. But that question is odd. Lord, are there a few being saved? Why didn't he ask this question? Lord, how many are being saved? Why did he ask this question? Lord, will there be a lot going to heaven? It seems that the person asking this question has either heard or realized and maybe didn't even want to accept it. only a few would be saved. Are there only a few? Just a few? Here's the Lord's response in the next few verses. He talks about the believers. There's just a few things about believers. He says, Lord, there are few are saved, yes. Believers are few. There are just a few believers. And then there's the narrow way that believers go. And then he says in verses 29 and 30, he says, they'll be coming from the east, the west, the north, and the south. It's not just a Jewish thing, it's for the whole world. So believers are few of us. We have a narrow way, and it's not just limited to one group of people, it's for all the world, because Christ came to the world. And aside from smaller pockets and towns, and aside from periods of time in history, like when the Pilgrims came, the Puritans came, you had like a 90% rate of Christianity at one time in our country. We don't have that now. As a matter of fact, Christians worldwide are few. 7.3 billion people were few. There are more going to hell than going to heaven. We have work to do. We have work to do. What about the unbelievers? There are many. In verse 24, many will not be able to get into heaven. They're curious. Many seek to enter. And let me say something real quick. I'm just aside. If you know that I follow church life and church growth and church health and church history, you'll know what I'm saying. We are not a seeker-sensitive church. We are a seeker-providing church. People that are seeking, we will provide the truth of God's Word. But that whole seeker-sensitive model started back in the 70s with a church which is almost crumbling apart, called Willow Creek, up in Illinois. When I was going to school up there, I was interviewed to serve at the second largest church in town with 400 people. The largest church had 4,000 people, and that was Willow Creek. In that church, the pastor there, the pulpit, staff is all fired, or left, resigned, and they're just crumbling. Because they were seeker-sensitive. Let the seekers decide what was going to happen, instead of God's Word decide what's going to happen. There are curious people. There are those who are left out. And then there's the hopeful. They're arrogant, some of them. We ate in your presence, and you taught in our streets, as if because you rubbed elbows with somebody, they're going to be your buddies from now on. These unbelievers are evildoers, they're destitute, they're disturbed, they're outcasts. As a matter of fact, there's a really sad portion of this, and that's in verse 28. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And listen to this is the unbeliever he's talking to. When you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves are thrust out. You go through life with or without Christ. But the judgment comes. And they can see a glimpse of the glory, but don't ever go. They can see it, but they can't live it. Those who are without Christ are thrust out. Be ready. Then there's the Pharisees' statement. The Pharisees' statement. There's a series of questions. The Pharisees kind of like pop up and say, because they're there, they're part of the crowd, the adversaries. There's the believers, the supporters of the adversaries. The Pharisees show up, and they ask this question. I don't know if they're trying to distract Jesus or to trick him, but they said, get out and depart from here. Herod wants to kill you. And one of my favorite lines in all of Scripture is right here. Jesus says, tell that fox. He didn't mince words. He didn't say, tell my friend. He didn't say, tell this godly man. Tell that fox, that sly fox, that one who wants to destroy. I've got a plan. And he goes on to explain that plan. Today, tomorrow, the third day. And it's the journey today, tomorrow, and the day following. I cannot die outside. I've got to die there. Jerusalem. What was Herod trying to do? And you think about that, you may ask the question when Christ would see Herod in Luke 23, we'll get to this in a few weeks. He looks at him, he questions him with many words, but Christ answered him nothing. Well, let's ask this question. What was Jesus trying to do? Look at the last verses here. Jesus' response. His responses were simple. He continued his preaching in verse 32. He continued performing signs, also in verse 22. He continued with his purpose, that is going to Jerusalem. He continued with his plan, and continued with even prophecy, explaining what he had to do. He continued preaching, performing signs, his purpose, his plan, and his prophecy. That's what he was. He was deliberate. He was focused. He spoke to individuals. He spoke to crowds. He faced questions. He faced rejections. But he had to go to Jerusalem. He had to be there. It was planned. It was prophesied. He had to go to the cross. Father, take this cup away from me if it's your will. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours. He had to go to the cross. Because the Bible tells us, greater love has no one than this, but that a man lay in his life for his friends. No matter how I get my life first. Spend my life first, well, for my entire Christian life, that I've known that is. But Jesus would do that. You say you're a disciple. People say they're disciples. That's great. Just how far would you go for him, though? How far would you go with him? Again, in this church, the Christians are the majority. Believe it or not, when we step out of these doors, you are in the minority. Number one. But you are a child of God. And you are a disciple. How far will you go with him? James and John, they stuck with him. We'll know the story, of course, later about John. They stuck with him. They made mistakes. Testimony was almost ruined, but there's salvation there. God took care of that too. There's nothing that can stop you. There's nothing you've done that can stop you from serving the Lord. You may think that's the case, but if you have a James and John-like personality, God's got that too. We understand that. So how far will you go with it? Father, we thank you for this time in your word, quickly yet necessary, to get us started as we go to the cross, to the story of the cross, to the story of the resurrection in this Easter time. Bless now the words that have been spoken.